Hi, my name's Justin Shelfon. I'm the engineering lead at PatchMyPC. We develop a third-party patch management solution for Microsoft SCCM. Prior to my current role, I was also a premier field engineer at Microsoft supporting SCCM. In this video, we're going to be doing a deep dive into the different components involved within the software updates feature of SCCM. This is going to include the client components, so things like scanning, downloading of updates, storing update compliance data in WMI, and how those state messages that get stored get sent up to your site server and then processed into the database. So we're also going to be covering some of those server components that process the different compliance data our clients send up for software update. This video is not going to cover some of the basics like software update groups, deployments, ADRs, deployment packages, or anything like that. That's going to come in the next video. This is going to be the deep dive to kind of understand what's actually going on when you do things like create your update groups and deploy those to collections within your environment. So with that said, we'll go ahead and jump right in. So I've got a single software update group within my environment. This is going to be the deployment that we're analyzing on our clients when they evaluate it and store the different compliance data that we're going to be looking at today. So that's got 21 different updates in this update group. So that all looks good. And what we've got is a client that we're going to go ahead and start up. Now, this client hasn't got any policy for this deployment, and it hasn't analyzed the deployment at all. This is just a clean client that wouldn't know anything about this when we're starting the client up. So we'll go ahead and RDP into that. And we'll go ahead and start the SMS agent host service. Just because it's delayed by default, it usually takes about 2 minutes to start up. So we'll go ahead and initiate that to get things running on the client side. The first thing that we're going to look at here is the different logs that are going to be involved in the initial requesting of policy. So before our client can do anything, it needs to get policy for these deployments. So what I'm going to do is open the CMTrace logging tool. And we'll go to our client logs. And we're going to open up the policy agent and policy evaluator log file. We'll merge those two. And then on the server, just to get things rolling a bit faster, we will go ahead and initiate a client check for computer policy through the client notification. So back on the client, what should happen any second now, it should get that notification and then start evaluating policy. All right, so it looks like we just got some policy for this machine. So it's evaluating all the new items that have been targeted to it. So that's going to include our software update group that we've deployed to it. So it looks like it's still running along. So while that's running, it usually only takes a couple seconds to go through that. But what we're going to look at next is where our policy is actually going to live. So the first thing that we need to do is get the information about the deployment. So within WMI Explorer, I'll include a link to this application. This just allows us to connect in and view different things within WMI easily. So the first thing we're going to look at is where our policy would get stored. So under the root CCM policy, there's going to be a machine instance here, and then we want to look at the actual config. So that's going to be the policy that's actually been downloaded and applied to this device. Within the actual config namespace, we're going to have different classes for policy that's being applied to this SCCM client. What we're going to be looking for is the CCM_update CI assignment. So we'll go ahead and find that. Okay, here we are. So we'll zoom in on that. So we're looking at the CCM update CI assignment. We're going to double click that, and then we're going to have an instance. So if we have an instance showing up, that means that we have got policy for our software update group deployment for this machine. So what we can see here, if I can just minimize this guy, bring it over to the left a bit more, we can see we have the assignment ID showing up on our client. We have the software update group name, so we can see that corresponds to the name of the software update group. If we come and copy that, come back to our console, look at our software library, our update group, and then look at the deployment tab, we can add the column for the deployment unique ID. If we look in on that, we can see it matches that same ID that ends in 844 on our client in WMI here. Okay. So that looks good. It looks like we've got policy, we've got the deployment. The next thing we want to look at is our whether or not we've evaluated it. So by default, the evaluation won't happen right when we get policy for it. There's some delay so that all clients don't hit the scanning when they get that policy right away. So it can take a little bit of time before we actually start analyzing our updates. So what we're going to look at next is the UpdatesDeployment.log. And this is going to show us the update groups that are being evaluated. So any deployments for software update groups, we'll see it evaluating in this log file. So to speed up the evaluation, we're going to come back over to our console, and we're going to right click on our client and do a client notification, and we're going to choose the evaluate software update deployment and run that cycle. Jump back to our client, and what should happen any second now, we're going to start evaluating our software update group in the UpdatesDeployment.log. So we can see over here we've got the assignment ID, so we can see it's the same one that ends in 844. We can see it has a total of 22 CIs. So a CI is a configuration item, which basically translates to an update. So that update group, when we looked at that in the beginning, we verified it had 22 different updates. Now within that scan for the UpdatesDeployment.log, we're not going to see a lot of data. We're just going to see some different information about the scan happening and then what updates are needed on the machine. So we'll see some information about the update IDs. But on the back end, when we did that scanning, there's a couple logs that we want to look at. First is the ScanAgent. So the ScanAgent.log is actually what's going to trigger the Windows Update agent to perform a scan. So if we come here and look at the log time here, about 34, that's when we got that information, we can see that it started to perform a scan. And it's going to scan against the different classes and things that we need to evaluate our software update group. Within here, we can also look at the WUAHandler, and that's going to verify what WSUS server that the client has configured to talk to. So in my case, it's scup.contoso.local. So that looks good. We can also see some information about us performing the scan in there as well. The next client log that we would look at for that scan data would be the update store. So the UpdatesStore.log is going to contain information about what updates are applicable that are being deployed to your machine during the scan cycle. So for example, we can see that we've got all these different updates within the update group, and they're either going to be missing or compliant within here. So we can see this one's installed, this definition update, but we can see a lot of these third-party updates that we publish, as well as some of the Windows Defender policy updates that we've deployed are applicable here. So we can see the status is missing. Now, all this data within your client, it gets stored in WMI. So back where we were looking at our policy, there's a couple of different namespaces that we want to check out for updates. So if we look under root, CCM, software updates, we're going to have a few different namespaces here. The first one we're going to look at is the deployment agent namespace. So this is going to show us a few different classes that are going to exist within here. The one that we're interested in is the target or CCM underscore target update EX1. So if we look at that, that's going to give us information about all the updates that are targeted to this machine. So this is going to be similar to what we saw in that UpdatesStore.log, where it was showing us what updates were needed. That data is then going to get stored in WMI. So we can see information about the different updates here. So the update applicability, if the applicability is 1, that means that the update is not applicable or it's not needed. If it's 0, that means the update is needed on this device. If we look at the update ID, so zoom in on that, we'll do a copy of this. And if we come back to the server, we can verify that each of these different instances here in this class is going to correspond to a different update within SCCM. So this would make sense. So since this is an update for Windows 10 1803, the 1805 cumulative update, this one is not applicable because we've already installed it. So that's going to be compliant for that state. Browse to another one here. Let's see if we can find one that is showing the applicability of 0. This one here. So if we go and copy this one and see what update that corresponds to, we can see this one is a third-party update. So this one is for Google Chrome. This is one that we published through our catalog. So this one should show as needed once we process this data up to the server. The next one, in the same namespace, we can come in and look at the class assignment compliance. So CCM_assignment compliance. And then we can see the different update groups that are targeting. In our case, we only have one instance, and we can see it's that same update group that ends in 844 that we're deploying. And here we can see whether or not all updates within this deployment is compliant. And if it's not, that's going to get sent up to our server for processing. Now on the client, the way that our compliance data gets sent back to our server is through what's called a state message. So if we come and look at the StateMessage.log, during that scan that started about 34 after, we can see all this data that started to happen in our StateMessage.log. So we can see all these different state messages getting added. And then here at the end, what we can see is that all these state messages got forwarded to our management point. So then the management point is then going to process the XML file for all these state messages into the database. So if we look back on our server, what I've done is I've stopped one of the components that run under the SMS executive service. So I've stopped the SMS_statesystem.log. So this is the component that's running that processes state messages into the database. So the reason I did this, if we come into our install directory for SCCM, we're going to have a folder called Inboxes. If we look within that folder, there's going to be a folder called Auth. So this is where our management point is going to be accepting those state messages sent from our client within IAS. So if we look in the Auth directory, we're going to look at the statesys.box. And then within here, there's going to be a folder called Incoming. So the incoming folder is where our clients are actually posting their state message files up to our management point. So if we look in here, since we stopped this component, we can see we have two different files that are waiting to be processed. The larger one is most likely our software updates that were sent from our client. So if we take a look at that, let me just wrap this text so we can see this a bit better. So we can see information here about our client. So for example, we can see the GUID of the client. So if we copy this guy, so the client GUID, if we come back to our console and search for that, that's going to reflect our client that we're using for scanning here. So we can add the device ID. So the resource ID, nope, that's not what I wanted. Just the ID column here. So we can see this GUID that we're searching for, it ends in 082. So that is in fact the state message that was coming from our machine. And within the state message, We can also see the net bias name here, our SCUP client machine. We're going to have all these different state messages that were coming in for these software updates. So for example, we can see the ID here. We're going to have a lot of different IDs. In my case, the amount of updates that I have synchronized and deployed is very small within my catalog. So we can see this is pretty small compared to probably most scan data that we would get from our software updates. But if we come back into our updates and search for this ID within the state message that was sent up, we can see that that corresponds to a different update. So in our case, this one was CCleaner. If we just go pick another one here, let's just take a look at this update ID. Copy that, and we'll paste that. Maybe I copied that wrong. Let's try another one. Maybe that was a state message for something that wasn't a software update. Let's see. Let's go to all software updates just in case that wasn't in the group. Interesting. Let's look back here and make sure I'm selecting this right. So this is the ID. What ID is that? The topic ID. Looks good. Let's try this guy here. There we go. So here's a definition update. So there may have been some additional IDs for these state messages that might not have been software updates, because there's a couple of different components that can send data through state messages. Let's just check one more. Okay, so here's another software update ID. So within that XML file that gets sent up for state messages, we can see all of these are going to have different types and different IDs to tell them what their compliance is. So if we come back in here and start up this component, before we do that, let's take a look at the log file. So the statesys.log, open that guy up, and then we're going to start that component. All right, so now we can see we've got it analyzing these different software updates that were sent through the state message. And if we come look at the incoming folder, we can see that those all those files have now been processed and they're now in the database. So if we come in here and look at this, we're not going to actually have any data showing up yet. So even though this has been processed, the software update group and each of the software updates aren't going to show any type of compliance data, because what has to happen is the updates need to be summarized. So even though the data about whether or not these updates have been installed or not, they exist in the database. But what's happening within your console is we're using different views that translate into that data, and these views haven't re-aggregated the scan data. So by default, this happens every hour using the summarization scheduling. So what we'll do to force this, we'll go ahead and run a summarization. And then in that same StateMessage.log, what we should, or the statesys.log, we should see the summarization run here in a minute. Okay. So it looks like we just ran the software update summarization, so we can see that task to process the summarization is now complete. So if we come back into our console now and we do a refresh, we can now see that we've got our compliance data showing up. So we can see that we have one machine for this software update group that is not compliant. If we break into that, we can see that we're not seeing compliance data yet for each of these updates, because they also have to be summarized for the updates. So we'll go ahead and run summarization against the updates, and that should have that process start here in a second. All right, so we can now see the software update group has now been summarized. So if we come back in here, all the updates within this group should now have run summarization. Looks like it might not have completely kicked in yet. Let's just wait one more minute. All right, so it ran one more time. I'm not sure if this is going to show up yet. Let's see. Yeah, so I think since we're still clicked in the software update group, it's actually still rerunning the main statistics that are showing whether or not the update group is compliant. So if we want to actually refresh summarization on the updates, we'll go ahead and go to the all software updates and choose run summarization. Now, in a large environment, this can take a while to aggregate the data, so you might just want to wait for that normal scheduled summarization to happen. Okay, so we can see that the summarization just processed. If we look a little closer, we can see that it processed a total of 22 different updates. So now if we come back into our console and refresh, or it looks like I didn't even have to refresh. If I just go and click on some different updates, we can now see they're showing as not required. So we'll go just kind of go through a little more here. We can see CCleaner is in fact needed. So this was one of those that we actually looked on the state message in WMI and verified that that was showing as needed. So it looks like this is all aggregated. So on the server side, this would be how things actually translate into what the client sends up to what the server is going to show. And obviously you can see that there's kind of a flow that needs to happen. First, the statesys has to process all the state message files that get sent up into the database. And then before they actually reflect in your console, the summarization task would have to run to aggregate that data to the views that the console is actually viewing. So going back to our client, if we look at Software Center, what we'll do is come over to an update here. And just for the first one, we'll just manually install one. So I'll go ahead and start the installation of Google Chrome. So this is a third-party update we published. And we'll kind of review what's actually going on here. So the first thing we'll look at is the cas.log. So this is the content request that will actually go up. So we'll see that the first thing that we have going on here, if we zoom in, we're making a request to download the content. So we can see that we found a distribution point and we're actually going out and downloading that content. It's going into the CCM cache folder and then the number 4 directory. So if we copy this and come back here and do a run and then paste in that, we can see this is the directory where the update actually got downloaded. If we open up this cab file, just because this was a third-party one and it gets encapsulated into a cab, we can see we actually have the binary that's going to be installed. If we come back and look at the updates handler, this is what's going to actually show the installation happening. So if we come back here, we'll try to figure out where we actually start the installation. There we go. You can see that we're starting the download. Download is complete for that update. Then we're going to scan. So the first thing that we do before we actually do the install is it would rescan to make sure the update is still applicable. Once that checks out, it's then going to hand the update off to the Windows Update agent. So if we unzoom out, we can see it handed off that update. So here at 12, so 53 after and then 13 seconds, we actually started to install it. And then in Updates Handler, we can see about 20 seconds later, we can see the installation was successful. So we got an exit code of 0. And it also states we don't need a reboot. Now, SCCM isn't actually performing the installation. The installation is actually handed off to the Windows Update agent. So just with Windows 10, it's kind of a bit of a pain compared to Windows 7 and previous versions. In order to review the Windows Update log, we have to run a PowerShell commandlet. So the get Windows Update log commandlet will create the Windows Update log and export it to your desktop. So if we come back in here, we can see the update started about 10:53 and 13 seconds. So if we come back into our Windows Update log, let's see if we can find out where that was actually happening. So we can see the updates are showing up here in the Windows Update agent log. We can see the update that was installed was Google Chrome. We've got the update ID. And this is where we're actually starting the installation. So in our case, Google Chrome was an MSI. So we can see it starting the installation of the MSI about 13 seconds after. So this all looks to match with what we're sending from SCCM. We can also see the command line. So we're running the command line. We're also within our catalog, we're setting the reboot equals really suppress, and then the restart would always be handled based on your update deployment. So this is what would actually happen here on the back end. We can see the installation actually completed at 32 seconds after, and we had the success code of 0, no reboot needed, and that's what got handed back off to the config manager component, which was the updates handler that was actually monitoring that. So that looks good. What I'm going to do is come back on my server side, and let's go ahead and restop the state system component. And then we'll come back into our client. We'll come into Software Center, and we'll just go ahead and choose to install all of these updates. And I'll pause while we wait for that to complete. All right, so it looks like we're all done. So if we come back here, they're all installed successfully. Now, it looks like none of them required a reboot, so that's unfortunate. I wanted to show you what would kind of happen there, but we can walk through what would happen. So under your namespaces, root CCM reboot manager, if there was a reboot that was needed, we could find it in the CCM reboot data class, and then we would have different instances that would show the properties of whether or not there was a restart and when that would happen. But if we come back to our software updates class, and if we look at the deployment and then the assignment compliance, double click that, look at our assignment. Looks like it hasn't updated yet, so that's interesting. It might just take a little bit to reevaluate the updates that have been installed before this instance get updated for our software update group. But what I do want to look at is a bit more details on the downloads of updates. So if we look at the data transfer service, this is where we're actually going to go out and download the updates. So if you have any issues where the updates are not downloading, the first log that you would want to start with is that CAS log to make sure that we were able to find the update on the distribution points, and then to actually monitor the update progress as it's downloading. It would then hand it off to the data transfer service that would actually download the updates using bits. Okay. If we come back to our logs, let's take a look at the StateMessage.log. And what we can see is that as those updates were being installed, we had all these additional state messages that were being sent up for those updates. So if we come back to our server, refresh this folder, we can see that we've now got some additional state messages showing up. So let's go ahead and start that component up. And then these should get processed into the database. So that looks good. So then we'll come back over here on our update group. We'll run summarization, and then we'll also run it against the all software updates. And we'll wait for that to complete. All right, it looks like that's done. So you can see that even though the required is showing 1 here, just because I haven't refreshed, the actual data that's being returned in that view when we click the update is now compliant. So if we do a quick refresh here, we can see that it looks like we're compliant with almost all the updates. If we come here and look back at our update group, we can see that we're all compliant for all the updates within this update group. So we've gone through and we've processed all those state messages, and we're now showing that we're all set here. So back on the client, while I paused the video, what I did do was I performed one software update scan cycle and then a software update evaluation cycle. So once I did that, there were still some updates that didn't reevaluate after the installation. So once I did that and looked at the assignment compliance for our update group, that did in fact switch over to true. So that all looks good. And then a couple more state messages got processed during that second scan, and it sent that compliance data back to our server and got processed. But I think that's all I had. So that should cover kind of the core components that would be involved from the client and server perspective of how updates would get analyzed and processed and deployed and installed within an SCCM site. So this was a pretty deep topic. There's a lot of components that were involved. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment in the comments on YouTube or on the accompanying blog post. Just leave a comment within there, and I'll be happy to answer anything that you might have. The next video, I think we're going to go over kind of some of the management of how we can create our update groups and deploy those, but I wanted to make sure that we kind of understood how this would actually happen on the back end, how it gets processed and stored and sent up to our server for processing. I hope this video was helpful, and thank you for watching.